Hello, everyone. This is Incorruptible Mass, and we are here to help you understand state politics. So we talk about why it is so broken. We help you get involved, and we talk about the life we could have here in Massachusetts if we fixed it. So we have the great fortune of having Kristina Mensik here with us from Democracy Behind Bars. But first, I'm just gonna let our regulars introduce ourselves, and that is Jordan Berg Powers.
My name is Jordan Berg Powers. I use he, him, and I am also, I guess, playing the part of Jonathan Cohn as well this week.
Ooh, wearing two hats. And I'm Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. And so, Kristina, I would love for you to, by the way, we're talking about incarceration and how it affects democracy in our state and across the country. Kristina, if you don't mind introducing yourself and also talking about Democracy Behind Bars and what your mission is and kind of how you go about that.
Absolutely. So first, also, thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to chat with you both today. My name's Kristina Mensik. I convene a coalition called the Democracy Behind Bars Coalition. We are an inside-outside group with folks across the state, and we are working to end what we call de facto disenfranchisement of those folks who are incarcerated but eligible to vote. We're working to end de jure disenfranchisement, the disenfranchisement of those serving felony convictions. And we're working to identify and dismantle other systems that I kind of group under the collateral consequences of incarceration. So ways that our system of policing and incarceration impact political representation in Massachusetts and political power.
Wow, well, that is a lot to bite off. And we're so excited to hear all the work that you're doing. I'd love to just take a little bit of a high level approach here and just remind everyone how bad things are in America, that we incarcerate more people per capita in America than any other country in the world. It is genuinely horrible. Our police officers also kill more people per capita than I believe any other country in the world. So we got to keep that in mind, that, we are not doing well in this arena. There is so much further that we can go. But I love the focus, not just on incarceration, because it has many horrible consequences for the people who are incarcerated, for their families, for their entire communities. But the focus specifically on how it affects democracy. And I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
Yep, absolutely. And I think first, a couple of other sort of high level things to keep in mind when we approach this issue. The first is that in Massachusetts, half of our incarcerated population are Black folks and people of color. And that is so disproportionate to the general levels of our population. And the other thing that I always keep in mind is that the history of felony disenfranchisement and laws that strip voting rights from folks who are incarcerated, it starts after slavery was abolished. And it's really hard not to look at our history of developing felony disenfranchisement laws and not see it as a system that targets Black people in this country and people of color, and is intended to suppress political representation of populations that have long fought for their political representation. Generally, oh wait, I'm so sorry. I forgot what your question was. I've got to.
Not at all. You're doing great. I love this, the take that you have. And, if you just want to talk a little bit more about sort of, maybe you can get into some of the specifics that
Yes.
Democracy Behind Bars is working on right now.
Yep, absolutely. So the first thing I also want to say is we organize with a group called the African American Coalition Committee, which is based in MCI Norfolk, and they really lead this work. Together, our theory of change is that we need to start by ending what we call de facto disenfranchisement. So make sure that all folks, which is typically half of our incarcerated population, I estimate normally between 7,000 to 9,000 folks, a little less right now because of COVID-related policies, But these are folks who have the right to vote, but we have never built a system to ensure that there's any kind of meaningful access to the ballot. We're doing that by organizing jail-based voting programs. We started formally as a coalition for the 2020 election, though I should say a lot of folks in our coalition, like Pastor Hobbs, who's based in Boston with Healing Our Lands, have been doing jail-based voting organizing for far longer than we've been together as a formal coalition. So in addition to that organizing, we're working right now to pass legislation, which exciting news is we have a bill that has been passed through the Senate with some really strong provisions that would protect ballot access for incarcerated folks. They include reporting requirements that would allow us to hold sheriffs and the DOC accountable. And they also include, the legislation also includes some measures that would ensure that more folks coming back into community after incarceration know that they have the right to vote. One thing to point out there is folks often ask me, how many people are impacted by de jure or de facto disenfranchisement. And I want to point to the fact that it's way more people than our incarcerated population at any given time. And there are two reasons for that. One is that folks who go through the system come out believing that they have permanently lost the right to vote. That's not just because of general misinformation. I have had so many people tell me that they've been told by corrections officers, parole officers, and probation officers that they've been permanently disenfranchised, even if they haven't lost the right to vote, never lost the right to vote in the first place. And then the second reason is our prisons and jails and contact with police or the criminal legal system. The way I see it is it's designed to suppress political participation. There's plenty of research, Ariel White, Michael Leo Owens, Hannah Walker, Chris Eugen, like all the research we need to show that contact with police or our prisons or jails makes people even less inclined to vote. And Ariel White's research shows that that impact is greater for Black folks who've had contact with police and criminal legal system than white folks. So I'm really excited about the provisions in the legislation that's moving through the State House right now. That would
before we get to the provision, which I know I asked you about, but like I'm so glad that you're returning to this topic because I was looking on Common Cause's website about democracy and incarceration, and it was saying that we currently jail more people than were enslaved during slavery. Now, of course, we've had population growth, but like when you think about it in these terms and you look historically at the way that it has been used, it's pretty clear that it I don't need to prove intent. We just need to show that this, in fact, disenfranchises especially the Black community, but in general, people of color.
And I just want to add one thing just to think about this for people to put in the thing what Kristina is saying, which is just, if interactions with the police decrease the likelihood that somebody's going to engage in the political process, it's just a reminder that my first interaction with the police was when I was 8 years old and has continued throughout my life. It sort of tapered as I've gotten older, but certainly was regular, right? So imagine the impact of that boom, 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 boom. And so, I always like to say that if you want to know whether or not government is worth investing in, talk to a poor person, right? They're the best, they're some of the most conservative people because they interact with the ways in which we fail them on a regular basis. So I just want to put that as a highlight to think like in a real personal way. Like if we know this meta thing, right, that like it can do it, just like, I don't know, one of the most boring people I know. Like I have had a constant interaction throughout my life with people telling me that I wasn't supposed to be a part of the system, a part of society.
Yeah, and it is about when you say that poor people are conservative, like the way I think of it is poor people just do not vote. I mean, that is statistically the less income you have, the less likely you are to vote. And so incarceration is also, of course, related to like generational poverty and all of these things, which, all of that together systemically really does disenfranchise these communities. So
it also, I think one thing that's important to point out here as well is that our system of especially, what we keep calling de facto disenfranchisement, the disenfranchisement of those folks serving misdemeanors or incarcerated pre-trial who have the right to vote is also a system that specifically punishes and targets low-income voters, because most of folks who are pretrial simply cannot afford bail. So that's why they're there in the first place. And then I think that it's also important to point out, this connects with another important election issue, which is same-day voter registration. The fact that folks who are low income don't have stable housing so often, or are more likely to be renters and move frequently, is another kind of sneaky little way that this system can work to keep people who are low income from exercising their right to vote, whether they've been incarcerated or not. If you don't know what address to list as your address for voting purposes, or if you miss a voter registration deadline, like what we have typically in Massachusetts, that's a whole 20 days out from an election.
And let's not, we don't want to miss a chance to dig on the State House, because it's been like 13 years that the same day registration bill has been at the State House, and it's still not passed. Like, it is completely unacceptable. Kristina, what is the legislation that you are trying to get through the legislature right now, and what state is it in?
Yeah, so there are two bills that I want to point out. The first is what we call the Jailbased voting bill, or H836 S474, which was filed by Senator Adam Hines and Representatives Liz Miranda and China Tyler. The other bill is the Votes Act, which is a really comprehensive elections bill that does a lot of stuff in addition to jail-based voting. Right now, the Votes Act is completely the moving vehicle. So it passed the Senate, and we were able to pass an amendment, or the Senate passed an amendment that took some of the, what I see as the pith of the other bill, the jail-based voting bill, and added it into the Votes Act. That's just a little background. So for right now, I think all we need to focus on, we can just focus on the Votes Act and some of the awesome, I think, really important details that are in there that will secure voting access for folks behind the wall. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I said exciting. That's exciting.
It is. And I think one of the things that is especially exciting, and this connects, on the one hand, you know, I don't want to get too excited yet. We have
because it passed in the Senate and it's at the State House. No surprise.
Yeah. So the bad news is, I think it's going to be a tougher fight in the House, as we have seen with same-day voter registration, which has passed the Senate, you know, a gazillion, that's the exact number, a gazillion times, and then gotten stuck in the House. The good news, though, or the thing that I am really excited about is this issue has suddenly moved very quickly. The first legislation on jail-based voting was filed in 2019. I think it's pretty unusual, or maybe I'm missing something here, for a bill to kind of, or issue to just be suddenly introduced. Like, I'm still having conversations with legislators explaining to them that we even have a population of eligible incarcerated voters, and to go from that basic education, like information barrier, to seeing legislation move. My optimistic read is that our I'm like, this is too optimistic. Our legislature understands that this is a fundamental democracy issue. Maybe that's a little too optimistic. I think my pessimistic issue view is that it's horrifying for legislators to realize that we have been effectively violating the Constitution by denying people who have the right to vote, protected by the Constitution, any kind of meaningful access to exercise it. So I don't know if our luck is about that. I don't know if this is moving. You know, I want to credit the hard work of our coalition and the Election Modernization Coalition and advocates on both sides of the wall who've been working on this for way longer than I've been, you know, even around. But I do think that we have an opportunity here, and I just hope that what we see going into January is the House picking up some of the momentum that we saw in the Senate, not doing what they've done before with same-day voter registration and effectively trying to block, you know, common sense election issues.
Yeah, well, let's not assume that it's appropriate for the House to sit on bills for decades, right? Let's assume that their job is to actually pass legislation that is no-brainer and obvious and makes us line up with the Constitution. Okay, so sorry, I get a little bit when people are like, oh, I'm so excited that like it's only been there since 2018. That's been 3 years. Why have they not passed it already? That is their job. That is what we put them there to do. Okay, rant over.
Agreed. Yeah.
Jordan, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about redistricting. I'm trying to move the conversation because I know that we have a little bit of a time limit today. And so I want to make sure we hit some important points.
Yeah, so let's just talk real quick about redistricting, because I think that this is a piece that people don't quite know, which is simply that a lot of the places like Norfolk County, Plymouth County, their populations count people of color who have been moved out of their communities and put into these prisons and into these jails. The jails are obviously more spread out, but the prisons and into the jails, and so they are overpopulated. Some of these counties that are whiter, more conservative, are taking the people of color who have been incarcerated. They get to count them in that location,
which means they get more funding.
So that means that they get more federal funding. It also means they get more state funding and more local funding based on the fact that they've been able to capture people of color from where they live and put them someplace else. This is, this is something that obviously counts towards them voting, because they are counting in those places, and they are, those places benefit from having those people be sort of, those prisons and jails being there. And yet, so I just think that piece, when we're talking about voting, is really important, because people might be like, well, I mean, why should they vote? Well, they are counted. They are, they are a part of the community when it comes to federal dollars, state dollars, and local dollars. So they should have a say.
And are there states where they are, counted in their communities and they get to vote and all those things?
Yeah, I think that one, something I'm excited about in this moment is that we are seeing other states move legislation forward to, one, count folks who are incarcerated. I mean, it doesn't change where the census counts. The fundamental issue is the census counts incarcerated people in the place where they're incarcerated. States are beginning to move to make adjustments so that basically the political representation of folks is put back into the place where they were before incarceration. And we're also seeing states really begin to pick up work around jail-based voting reform and also felony reenfranchisement. I mean, DC, I want to just shout out, just restored voting rights to all incarcerated people there. Illinois passed some really exciting legislation a couple of years back that makes
the Florida vote. There was a big vote in Florida, a couple of years back.
Yep. So I think that on all fronts, this is absolutely kind of a moving. I see it as a moving train and a movement that's only going to continue to pick up steam. And one thing I also want to echo related, Jordan, to what you said is for the folks who lead this work from the inside in Massachusetts, especially Derek Washington, who's incarcerated, and Susan Baranowski, Alameen Patterson, who's the chair of the African American Coalition Committee in MCI Norfolk. A lot of why they're motivated to lead this effort is because they see the fact of prison gerrymandering coupled with the fact of their own disenfranchisement as creating something that is not all that different from slavery, especially when you factor in these other issues about menial paid labor on the inside.
Oh, can we stop for 1 second? Because menial paid labor means people, even in Massachusetts, they're paid, I believe, am I correct? It is less than $1 an hour.
Less than $1.
Less than $1 an hour. I mean,
that's important because they often put fees on top of things. Also, they underfund, feed people. So if you were to say need a certain, there is a basic standard caloric intake for human sustenance, we don't really meet that. They rely on 500%, 300% uptick in cost through the commissary to help meet their basic caloric intakes that are required for the day. That money, but when they work, they get paid less than an hour. So imagine, we're worried about inflation of 4%. Imagine if all of your goods cost 500 times what they currently cost, and your pay went from whatever you're paid to less than $1 an hour. That is the reality that a lot of them are facing. That is slavery.
Yeah,
And you
100%.
couple that with the racism embedded with this system. We always, one of the things I think it's important to, like, again, take a step back is our system does not incarcerate people who commit crimes. If you steal something, you're basically never gonna get caught. If you like commit like a fraud against your corporation, you will definitely never get caught. No one will care. You don't pay your workers. So a worker works for you, you don't pay them. You will maybe get a fine from the AG, but you won't go to jail. What our system does is it jails drug addiction and the problems with drug addiction around it. Almost every dollar in our system goes to jailing people with drug problems. So we are disenfranchising Black people and brown people, and a few unfortunate white people have been caught up in this system for drugs, for drug problems, for things associated with drugs, for things around drugs. That's the only thing our system does. And then on top of that, we're paying them wages that are slave labor, making them pay more for everything, including phone calls, including food, right? That's the system we have. It's not a system that is getting at people who are quote unquote doing bad things. And I think that that's always important that we name that.
And if you're listening to this podcast, just hit pause and let that sink in. Okay. Kristina, do you mind talking to us a little bit specifically about the cost of phone calls and what that has meant for your organization and for organizing within these community, within the jailed community?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Massachusetts, as in most states, except now I think Connecticut was one of the first states to pass a no-cost calls bill. The cost of making calls is extremely high, and it falls on incarcerated citizens, and it also falls on, I think there's also some important research that shows how a lot of the costs of incarceration fall on especially women and families who are, if you're making 14 cents an hour, you're not going to be able to cover the cost of enough calls to help your son with his homework, for example. So it falls on support systems on the outside as well. For us, the only way that we have a partnership with the African American Coalition Committee and are able to make sure that folks who are impacted by the policies that we're working on are able to not just be part of, but lead these conversations is with outside foundation funding. In less than a year, we've spent about $4,000 on basic, like, I'm not talking just like chatting for hours. This is basic calls about, meetings with legislators, getting testimony lined up for hearings, just basic organizing. So I really think that those issues are democracy issues. The other thing I do want to point out, especially as we talk about the reality of the conditions of confinement, is if I can pivot a little bit to some of Massachusetts history on this issue, which the short is incarcerated folks, especially in MCI Norfolk and MCI Concord, tried to organize to address the reality of conditions of confinement. And the result of that organizing, which included a voter registration drive and a number of voter registration drives, actually, a political action committee that was met by the governor in the year 2000, filing a petition initiative that disenfranchised those serving felony convictions. That's a long way of saying that Massachusetts history on this issue is for the first 200 plus years of our history, we did not take the right to vote away from incarcerated people. We took the right to vote away to punish civic engagement work by incarcerated people who were organizing to try and have some say and some political power to improve their conditions of confinement. I approach this work as a democracy reform person. I think that civic engagement is good. And I thought that the whole point of civic engagement is it winds up getting rewarded, right? Yeah.
And I'm gonna ask our listeners,
Yeah.
You just heard Kristina say that for 200 years, people who were jailed still had the right to vote, but only when they began to organize and be civically engaged, that right to vote was taken away. So just another pause, pause, think about that for a sec, and then come back.
And just to note that, like, not like Kristina, are the people who wrote these things that we're supposed to adhere, they thought of it as a democracy issue. They thought of it as a basic right. They thought of it also as an important piece to linking people when they get out, because the purpose of this is not to keep people forever in behind bars. The purpose supposedly is to have people serve time so they come out better. Well, what better? They understood, and we understand, that this is about making sure that people are brought back into our communities in ways that we can, so they're linked back in, they're brought back in, they're brought back into the fold, right? And so continuing a process of punishment continues to separate them and force people back into the shadows.
I will say that was my one, like the strongest realization that I had after I spent a couple of nights in jail in Los Angeles County was there is not a human being on the planet that would be improved by what happened inside that jail. Not one person would come out better, not one.
Well, feels like a whole other, it's a whole other, other half hour.
Oh my gosh, yeah, a whole other half hour.
It hits on a really important point on why we are trying to end felony disenfranchisement, is both that it serves no functional purpose. It does nothing except to communicate to folks on the inside that they are not valued members in any way of our society, which is a message that folks get in all of the other ways. And for the folks who I work with in MCI Norfolk, getting the right to vote is absolutely about being connected to their home communities, being able to weigh in on their kids' school committee, but it's also fundamentally about hope. It is something that will allow folks in the AACC, and once we restore the right to vote, folks across the Commonwealth, even if they are serving long sentences, to feel like there is a community that's waiting for them on the other side, that they are still, a connected participant of.
So I know you only have a couple of minutes, and a couple of things we talked about earlier were the petition initiative that you're working on. It would be a constitutional amendment. You also talked about the sheriff's races. So do you want to pick maybe one of those and talk a little bit about what's happening there?
Sure, absolutely. So I think I'll just highlight very quickly that our long-term goal as a coalition is to restore voting rights through a petition initiative. That is a long process, and we're going to need all the help and support that we can get to make that happen. In the a little bit shorter term, we're looking at statewide sheriff's races next fall. Our hope is that by next fall, jail-based voting legislation will have been passed. And what we can do is oversight, implementation, and organize to get out the vote behind the wall. We've done a little bit of research and found that of all of the elections, folks on the inside are most unsurprisingly excited about participating in sheriff's races. So I just want to flag that as something to look forward to next fall and for folks to participate in. But in order to have the turnout that we need in the fall 2022 elections, we really do need to get this jail-based voting bill passed. So my little plug of call to action is reach out to your representative and tell them that you support the Votes Act and especially the jail-based voting legislation within it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Really horrifying but great conversation. And hopefully people, have some hope in their brains about where we're going to go in the future. So thank you. We look forward to continuing the conversation and hearing how things are going.
Totally. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Talk to y'all next week.